without further ado, let me introduce Sheri Baucom. So Sheri has 15 years of diverse experience in the oil and gas industry, ranging from pipeline integrity engineering at a gas pipeline operator to director of integrity services at a consulting firm to business development at an inline inspection vendor. Sheri now leads product marketing at Earth Solution, a data-driven software company where she witnesses firsthand how technology can be leveraged to solve problems in the asset integrity space. Sheri, the floor is yours.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. Perfect. All right. First off, oh, my presentation went away. There you go. Okay. First off, I want to say that I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I have been coming to PPIM since I was in Energetic Engineer 1, I would like to say, so it's really exciting to be here at the Wednesday morning session. I also wanted to briefly mention that OneBridge Solutions is now Earth Solutions. That happened about 3 months ago, and that's really all the time, or all that I have time to say about that. But if you want to learn more information, we have a booth at the expo next door. All right, so let's get into it. So what is the state of integrity? So the state of integrity is a data analysis project, essentially on analyzing the data that is uploaded into our software called SIM, everything from inline inspection reports to close interval surveys. We get pipeline data from GIS integration, attributes like pipeline vintage, pipeline coding, MEOP, where your river crossings are. We also bring in repair data analysis on the inline inspections, what anomalies are repaired and why. And then, of course, like I said, repair data, so you can generate those nice unity plots and perform API 1163 performance validations. So there's a lot of different types of data, pipeline integrity data, that's brought into SIM. And in terms of inline inspections, as of November of last year, we had about 413,000 miles of inline inspections in our SIM platform. So that's enough to circumnavigate the Earth over 16 times, in case you were wondering. We estimate that our customers operate at least 50% of the piggable oil and gas pipelines in the US, according to PHMSA numbers in 2023. So it's a lot of data, and it's also a very diverse data set in terms of the ILI companies, pipeline operators, and technologies that are represented in the ILI data set. So one of the downsides to having access to so much data is that there's about 100 different questions that you can ask of the data. So what did we analyze for? We looked, when we started the State of Integrity project about 2 years ago, we looked at everything from pipeline properties to trends in ILI technology to trends in operator or ILI companies that our pipeline operators like to use. Looking at repair conditions, what conditions were operators using the most, what conditions were triggering repairs the most. We looked at anomaly types over time. We looked at correlation between anomaly types and pipeline vintage, et cetera, et cetera. We looked at a lot of different stuff. And when we presented these findings to our clients the last 2 years, unsurprisingly, the topic that our clients most gravitated towards was ILI performance. I think because this gives operators access to information that they normally wouldn't have. So most pipeline operators tend to use the same 2 to 5 ILI vendors. Yet, as you see in the expo, there's about 30 out there. So of course, our pipeline operator clients love to see how their 2 to 5 ILI vendors stack up against the rest of the vendors that are out there, right? So in case you're an ILI vendor in the room and you're getting nervous about what I'm about to talk about today, answering the question, who's the best vendor according to our data set, is not the question we're going to talk about today. I thought it was way too early to broach that topic. But I didn't want to incite a heated debate. However, we settled on an even better question, which is what factors lead to a high-performing inline inspection? And that's the question we're going to answer today. So if you are in charge of selecting the ILI vendor at your pipeline operator, or you're an ILI analyst analyzing ILI data, or you're actually providing ILI services, this question, the answer to this question should benefit you. So what are we talking about when we're talking about ILI systems? So for this study or this analysis specifically, we focused on metal loss technologies, so MFL and ultrasonic. And then we looked at depth sizing performance only. So looking at predicted ILI depth versus the field found depth or truth data, and then comparing those two values. And then performance was quantified using the terms tolerance and certainty as they're described in API 1163. So in case you're not one of the 1163 experts in the room, which I know we have, let me briefly explain what certainty and tolerance are. So tolerance is the range by which the ILI predicted depth is within the field found depth of the truth data. So if the ILI system predicts a metal loss feature of 30%, how likely is it to be within plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 20% of the field found depth? And the certainty is the probability or percentage that occurs. So this is a nice example of the calculated certainties with a tolerance of 20% by anonymized ILI companies. The ILI companies are on the x-axis. So you can look in this graph and say vendor Q is doing a really great job. Vendor P is doing the worst. They're anonymized for a reason. So vendor Q, 96% of its data points or 96% of its ILI predicted depths were within plus or minus 20% of the field found depths. So good job, vendor Q, who is unfortunately no longer in service. So it's an inactive company. That might give you a clue as to who that data comes from. We did include vendors that are no longer in service in this analysis. And the number of data points are indicated by the blue line on the secondary axis. So these are the factors that we hypothesize would have a great impact on ILI performance. So how does ILI company impact depth sizing performance? How does depth sizing performance vary by MFL versus ultrasonic? How does the depth of metal loss affect performance, or the classification of the metal loss as defined by Pipeline Operators Forum? So those are the types of questions that this paper seeks to answer. So to specify exactly what data set we used for this analysis, of course we could only use ILI depths that had a corresponding repair depth. So that brought us down to about 82,000 anomalies that had a corresponding field found depth, mostly from standard resolution axial MFL, mostly external metal loss, mostly general corrosion or pitting based on Pipeline Operators Forum classification, about 1,300 pipelines and a almost 50-50 mix from gas pipelines versus liquid pipelines. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of how the paper and the analysis is organized. So part one is exploring variability. So really answering that question, what factors impact performance? And then part two is looking at performance by these four different factors. And then part three is looking at performance by assessment year or performance over time. To answer that question, are we getting better? So part one, like I said, is exploring variability, and variability mathematically translates to standard deviation. So basically calculating the standard deviation of certainties. And so this is a similar graph to what we just looked at, where it's the certainties graphed with using a 10% tolerance versus a 20% tolerance is what we looked at. And instead of saying vendor Q is doing great and vendor R is not doing so great, we're looking at the range of performances here. So as you can see, the performances or certainties range from 49% with vendor R all the way to 85% with vendor Q. So that's a wide range of performances. It's a wide range of certainties. So we would say that there's high variability within the ILI company factor. Another takeaway from part one that we found is that there's higher variability with a smaller tolerance. So with a 10% tolerance, there's a wider array of performances, which makes sense, I think, anecdotally. If you're going to judge something with more stringent requirements, you're going to get a wider array of results. Okay. So going back to looking at what factors have the highest effect on performance. So taking a look at these 5 factors, what would you think had the highest impact on depth sizing performance? I'm not going to make you raise your hands, but just think about it. ILI company, is it the technology, the metal loss classification? This diagram will kind of tip you off here. It was the depth of the metal loss. And the way that we figured that out is we bend the anomalies by 10% intervals, so 10 to 20%, 20 to 30, and then looked at the certainties, calculated certainties, and how they varied as they went across the depths. And I'll show you that graph in a second. So the depth of the metal loss feature actually had the highest impact on performance, depth sizing performance. And to kind of further that, when you looked at a 10% tolerance, the most important factors were depth, followed by eye-like company and technology. And then when you looked at a 20% tolerance, technology kind of went away. And then it was pipeline operator that was the second most important factor, followed by eye-like company. So a more useful way to say this, to kind of put it into layman's terms, essentially, if you need high depth sizing performance for your metal loss anomalies, it's really important to focus on the eye-like company and the technology, the selection of the eye-like company and technology. And then if that's what you're doing, then good job. But if you don't need high depth sizing performance, so if 20% off is sufficient for you for whatever reason, it's really important to just select a high performing eye-like company. The technology, any of the technologies that we analyze would be sufficient for your use. So that's, again, from the pipeline operator's perspective. Now, as a pipeline operator, it's hard to choose or change the pipeline operator. So trying to think of things that are in the locus of your control, right? Another interesting insight from this part one is that the classification of the metal loss actually had the lowest impact. And which of these factors do we typically have different depth sizing performance for MFL? Metal loss classification. So it actually had the lowest impact on performance, which is kind of a curious thing. I've never seen a performance spec where they had different performance specs for depth of metal loss. Maybe we should, I don't know. Kind of curious. We also looked at metal loss classification in two different ways. As the metal loss was identified by the eye-like vendor, so did the eye-like vendor identify as pitting, and then we also calculated the classification from the field measurements. So what was it actually in the field? Was it found to be a pit, or was it found to be axial slotting? So that's why there's two graphs there. One of the last insights I'll talk about with part one is that we found that high variability exists within axial MFL standard resolution. And this makes me laugh a little bit, because if you've worked for an eye-like vendor, or if you've worked for a pipeline operator on the other side, you probably are very aware of this. And I think this makes sense. MFL is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, metal loss eye-like technology. And so there's going to be a lot of variability that exists with that technology. There's a lot of vendors that offer that service, but it showed up in a significant way. And we actually found that the variability that was seen within the eye-like company, you kind of could see that when we singled out axial MFL technology, that high variability was driving the variability within the eye-like company. So essentially, not all axial MFL systems perform the same. It's really important to know, and that will come up again in part two of the study. So part two, we looked at performance by certain factors. So first off is assessing performance by technology. So on the x-axis, you'll see the different types of, we call dominant technologies that we assessed for. So ultrasonic versus standard resolution MFL versus circumferential MFL versus combination MFL versus high resolution MFL. So a lot of MFL data. So if you look at all the metal loss of all shapes and sizes, ultrasonic outperformed all the other MFL technologies, which is in line with published performance specs. And if you know about the technologies, ultrasonic is a direct measurement of wall thickness. MFL is an indirect measurement of wall loss, right? So that's to be expected. However, what I thought was surprising is that ultrasonic did not outperform the other MFL technologies significantly. In fact, it's only a few percentage points off from axial MFL standard resolution. And knowing from the last slide that there's high variability within MFL technology, we took the top quartile, or the top performing eye-like companies, and just graphed that. And we found that when we took the top performing eye-like companies, MFL actually outperformed all the other technologies. So outperformed ultrasonic quite significantly, especially in the 10% tolerance. The certainty for MFL was above about 10%, as you can see in this graph. So another way to say that is, if you select axial MFL from a high-performing eye-like company, you can get as good, if not better, performance, depth sizing performance in an ultrasonic system, essentially. which I think is good news for all the gas pipeline operators out there. You might not be really missing out by not being able to run those ultrasonic systems. And again, it really shows that there's high variability in the axial MFL standard resolution. We also looked at performance by depth of metal loss. And so, like I said, we organized the anomalies into 10% bends, so 10 to 20%, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. And as expected, performance does decrease as the depth of metal loss increases. This is a known phenomenon that happens. It's been analyzed and studied and whatnot. What's interesting is that this trend is more pronounced for standard resolution axial MFL. And so looking at a metal loss 50% or greater, we found that all the other MFL technologies actually outperform standard resolution axial MFL quite significantly, especially when you looked at 70 to 80 and 80 to 90%. So the purple is the high resolution MFL. So again, another way to say this is if you think you have a pipeline with shallow metal loss features, you're probably fine just using a standard resolution axial MFL. But if you think that you have deeper metal loss anomalies, 50% or greater, you are better off using one of the other MFL technologies, and more specifically, what we have data for is the high resolution MFL. We just didn't have enough data for the circumferential MFL and then the combination. That's why they don't show up in the 70 to 80 and 80 to 90% bends. Ultrasonic also outperformed axial standard resolution for those deeper bends as well. So we also looked at performance by metal loss classification, of course. And some curious insights here. So you might be able to see this graph, but we found when we looked at all the MFL technologies, MFL actually had the best performance for pinholes. Why is that interesting? Well, a lot of time MFL technologies historically have been so bad at detecting and sizing pinholes that they typically don't even have performance specs for pinholes. So I found that quite interesting, that actually they're quite good at sizing pinholes, followed by general corrosion, pitting, and the other classifications. So that was an interesting insight that kind of defied our expectations or our hypotheses. Another thing that we looked at with this classification was how anomalies are being misclassified from the ILI versus the field. So the POF diagram on the left is showing the classification of the anomalies as predicted by the ILI, and the middle POF diagram is showing the classification as derived by the field-based measurements. And so it almost looks like there's anomalies or metal loss features that are moving into that pinhole region. So it's essentially showing that yes, these systems, these ILI systems, are detecting pinholes. They may not be classifying them correctly as pinholes. So we created these misclassification matrices for high resolution MFL and for all the other technologies to see what was being classified as what. And so, for example, pinholes, 40% of the time pinholes were being found in the field. They were being misclassified or misidentified by the ILI as circumferential slotting. Just kind of interesting tidbits there, and we have these matrices for all the technologies. So again, pinholes are being detected, and they're being sized pretty accurately by MFL systems. They may not be just being classified correctly as pinholes. So the last part was looking at performance over time, so performance by assessment year. And so again, this kind of defied expectations or our hypotheses. So you might be thinking that we would be leaps and bounds above where we were in 2005. Our performances is just skyrocketing, right? You would think. But as you can see here, these are the calculated certainties over time from 2003 until 2024. And it looks quite level. So what we found is that overall, performance, depth sizing performance, has been increasing overall, but recently, or a local trend is that it's actually been, performance has been decreasing, or average error has been increasing, specifically around 2020. And again, this is just based on our data, all right? And so we had some hypotheses about why this would be happening. Why is performance trending down? And so one of the hypotheses that we threw out in the paper, this is all explained, and what is supported by the data that we have in SIM is that maybe the anomalies that our pipeline operator clients are going after are changing. So maybe these anomalies that we're going after are more challenging for ILI systems to size. So gone are the days where we're going after nice general metal loss or isolated pits, right? Our problems are getting more challenging. Our anomalies that we're going after are harder for our ILI systems to detect. And when I gave this presentation a few days ago, someone also mentioned maybe we're just really good at doing engineering analyses on corrosion. We're much better. Gone are the days where we're just going after everything over 50%. We're actually going after things that are more complicated, like long seam corrosion or circumferential slotting. For whatever reason, we've seen an increase in. I also put in internal corrosion, which is not necessarily more difficult for our ILI system to detect. It might be more difficult for, or size. It might be more difficult for the NDE systems to size because, of course, it's on the outside of the pipe, which would be negatively impacting the truth data. So, and when I was putting this presentation together, it really made me think of one of my favorite presentations at PPIM in 2019. Chris Yoxel, I don't know if he's in the room, but it was one of my favorite presentations because he talked openly and honestly about the challenges that our industry faces. And he said, look guys, our problems are not getting easier. Our challenges are actually getting more complex. And what are we doing as an industry to meet those challenges? And he talked a lot about the different types of solutions, turning data into information faster, making faster decisions. He said we're pretty slow at making decisions, which I was like, as a young engineer, I was like, yes. But one of the single most important solutions that he singled out is collaboration. Working together, collaborating, sharing data, which is kind of the key to this project right here, and also why we are here today. Like all good research projects, this project has brought up a number of questions. So I feel like with one question answered, I have 3 more. I'm sure you looking at our data set have a number of questions that you would like to ask of the data. Applying this analysis to different anomaly types, of course, has been top of mind. We've already been asked to, how can you apply this to cracks? I know that we have a presentation on hard spots coming up, and we've been seeing hard spots coming up in the data. So, of course, there's a million things I would like to ask the data. In terms of additional insights, I think one of my personal lessons learned of this project is that sometimes the data supports your hypotheses and sometimes it doesn't. And it's important to not be married to your assumptions and really listen to what the data is telling you and what the data is not telling you. I'd also like to thank our clients for being so generous with their data and so generous with their time. I've had a lot of questions about the data and sometimes what people enter into a sim, so it's been really nice. And like I said, collaboration has been key to this project. And I wanted to end by saying that I've been in this industry for 15 years, and I really don't think that this project would have happened 15, even 10 years ago. And if you're new to this industry, welcome, hi. But historically, our industry has not been very good at sharing data, or has been kind of hesitant to share data. I want to put that politically correct. But I've seen a shift, personally I've seen a shift, and this project is a testament to that. In fact, our clients have been asking us, use our data, tell us what you find, we'd love to know. So I love that, I think that's really inspiring, and I really do think that that's what will propel the industry forward, so. With that, I will thank you for your attention and open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Sheri.
Timely.
Do we have any questions?
Sheri, excellent paper.
Thank you.
DNV did a study in 2016, and I think they had 3,000 anomalies, and you just blew that way up, so congratulations.
Thank you.
One of the things they studied, though, was diameter of pipe.
Okay.
Have you looked at that to see if it varies small diameter versus large diameter?
No, but what did you find? Cliff notes.
DNV found that as you get smaller, it gets more spread out.
More of the
so
depth.
there's some correlation there.
Depth sizing performance decreases.
Yeah. So just something you
lovely.
might look at.
And we totally have access to that data. Okay. Beautiful.
Hi, Sheri. Excellent presentation.
Thank
On
you.
the UT versus MFL comparison, I'm assuming that you were looking at a depth measurement for per feature, whereas UT can map a feature with multiple depth, readings and actually give you a profile, so you can use effective area methods. And so I'm assuming that if on the basis of a burst pressure calculation, UT would still be better because it can give you the mapping of the contours of the flaw. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, excellent point. And I was kind of worried that this was almost too simplified, because I do think there's some nuances with the ultrasonic data, and you're absolutely correct. Because ultrasonic, let me kind of rephrase what you're saying, because ultrasonic is a direct measurement of wall thickness, it's a lot more accurate at getting the actual profile of the metal loss feature, and that's really not captured in this analysis. So just to say ultrasonic is better but not by much, we're not actually thinking about the profile. And burst pressure is something that we didn't look at. We just looked at depth sizing performance versus burst pressure performance. I think that's another thing where ultrasonic would shine, would outperform axial MFL. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
Thank you. Have you looked at correlations between the data? So for example, one of the factors was that the operator affected the ILI performance, which is not an obvious finding. And is that perhaps because there's a correlation between some operators who've got deeper metal loss or something? And I guess the second question, have you corrected for sample size? Because I guess in some cases the sample size is going to be quite small, and that could affect, if you're comparing different sample sizes, and the sort of scatter that you get with that could be a factor.
Absolutely. So let's answer the second question. So this is discussed in the paper, and we definitely did see a correlation between lower sample size leading to outliers on both sides. So lower sample size leading to really high performance, and also leading to really low performance. So we ended up excluding, anytime there was data, there was less than 23 or less data points, which we felt good about looking at the data set, then we excluded it. Yeah, so you'll see, this is actually a good example. When we looked at high-performing ILI companies, combination MFL dropped out because we didn't have more than 23 data points. So we did account for that. And that's higher than, I think, what 1163 recommends for a level 2 and a level 3. I think it's like 6 and 10 or something. So we felt really good about that number. Second question is interesting. So you're asking about the effect of pipeline operator, right? So that's a little tricky because even like looking at effect of ILI company, there's so much built into that. It's their technology, it's the way they deploy the technology, it's their people, it's their processes. So how do we control for that? And it's very similarly. So pipeline operator, it's their people, it's their processes, but there's also their pipelines. And we have to remember that this analysis is not done on this one magic pipeline. So to say that ultrasonic is better than MFL is, you have to understand what's happening there. They're being run on different pipelines. You might select ultrasonic to run on a more challenging pipeline, and therefore it's being negatively impacted. So we talked about that in the paper as well. There might be some kind of selection effect bias, where sometimes you're selecting a circumferential MFL for a very specific reason. You're selecting ultrasonic, and its performance is negatively impacted because you're running it on more challenging pipelines. So I don't know if I answered your question, but no, it just kind of like left it as like pipeline operator, and we didn't dig into that or figure out how. But I do think it would be interesting to look at pipeline attributes like diameter, like like how does the pipelines that they're actually being run on affect, so we can kind of take away the people and the pipelines and separate it out. I think that would be interesting.
We're about at time, so unless you have a very quick question, no question, let me welcome Josiah Sutu from ExxonMobil for the YPP Awards.